Hello, bonjour. Today is February 10th. It's 5th février 2026. On commence with the adoption of the agenda.
L'ordre du jour soit accepté sans modification.
Okay, proposal rapport. Madame Leblanc, Monsieur Cléroux, all in favor. Carried. Disclosure of pecuniary interests. None. We'll move on to item 4. We're going to switch the numbers around. We're going straight to 4.2. Public Works, Bylaw Enforcement, 4.2.1 TP1 2026, achat d'une remorque à bascule type up pour le déneigement.
Que le Conseil accuse réception de rapport initiatif TP1 2026 et approuve l'achat d'une remorque à bascule type au montant de 6 720 plus taxes.
Merci. Proposeur appuyable. Madame Chalron, Madame Leblanc. Questions or comments? All in favor?
Oui.
Carried. Madame Leblanc? No. Okay. Item 4.1.1. IM 4 2026. Plans de gestion des actifs municipaux au niveau de stock. We have a consultant present here to do a delegation regarding this report. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this evening's council meeting. I will be with you.
Hold on, we can't hear you, Marissa. 1 second.
Okay, I think I might have solved the issue there. You can hear me now? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me today. I will be presenting as noted on the proposed level of service options for your asset management plan. So just bear with me for one moment. I'm just going to get my screen sharing set up and then we can get going. Okay, so from what I can see, it's visible on your end. Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first off, like I mentioned, thank you for having me here today. My name is Marisa Benuelos Spencer and I'm with PSD Citywide. Today I'll be talking to you about the proposed level of service options as part of the 2025 Asset Management Plan. To support that, we'll have 5 agenda items for today's presentation. We'll start off with a brief overview of proposed levels of service and we'll distinguish current from proposed levels of service. From there, we'll identify the process that was deployed to develop the proposed level of service options. And after that, we will explore the proposed level of service options that were selected for analysis. In the 4th step, we'll go through the analysis of those options. So we'll identify the projected changes in condition and risk, as well as the associated cost with each of the options presented. In conclusion, we'll end off with a recommendation from staff of which proposed level of service option they feel should be selected, considering the costs, the benefits, and the risks presented. So starting off with the first item, proposed level of service brief overview. A question that might come to mind is when we say level of service, what do we mean? So a level of service, it can be defined as a current level of service or a proposed level of service. The distinction between the two is that a current level of service will reflect the actual performance of a group of assets. Typically, this grouping would be things like your road network, your water network, vehicles as examples. And this will always be as of a defined past measurement date. An example of a current level of service could be the average condition of the road network as of 2024. This contrasts with the proposed level of service, which will reflect a forecasted future asset performance by a defined future date. So this could be, for example, the average condition of the road network between 2026 and 2035. So again, the main difference between the two is current looks at past data, proposed looks at projected future performance levels. And as we'll see, this is based on considerations of cost, risk, and condition. The value that proposed levels of service provides is that it shifts the conversation from how are our assets performing today to how do we anticipate or project our assets will perform into the future based on things like our current level of funding. This helps to meaningfully project and illustrate different trade-offs in funding levels with projected changes in asset condition and asset risk. This helps connect, again, those performance levels to investment requirements. So it, again, is showing this trade-off. Often in the context of proposed levels of service, and generally within the context of asset management, you will hear the phrases of cost, risk, and performance. Generally, these three factors will impact and kind of culminate in the level of service outcomes. Generally, the dynamic between the three is that as you increase cost or investment, you have improvements in asset performance and reductions in asset risks. The opposite is also true. So if you reduce the investment that your assets are receiving, you generally have increased risks and reduced performance. That same dynamic is similar to a dynamic that you might experience with your own assets. The process for developing proposed levels of service was a multi-step process. I'm going to start off by outlining what the process is, and then from there, we'll work through some of the information that was gathered through each of these steps and the outputs that came with it. So this process contained 6 major steps. The first step was what we call a data collection and analysis step. In this step, we worked very closely with municipal staff to gather data on all of your what we call tangible capital assets. Generally, those are assets over $5,000 in value. This would be assets from a variety of categories, such as your road network, your water network, fleet, machinery, and equipment. Not only did we seek to collect what assets you have, we also worked to collect key information about every single asset. So for every single asset, we have the estimated cost to replace the asset, we have an estimated condition of the asset, we have the capital investment requirements, in addition to, in some cases, additional attribute data, such as, for example, the size of a pipe. We reviewed this information in conjunction with your financial information. Here we sought to understand historically how much investment are your assets getting. When we look at investment, we only look at sustainable capital funding sources. That is typically funding from taxes, rates, CCBF, and OSIF. So we're not including any one-time funding, such as grants that we can't reliably, expect to receive, that we don't generally have control over. The second stage was what we call a discovery stage. In this stage, we sought to bring information from stage 1, that data collection analysis, and combine it with information from residents and key staff on assets. So we used your strategic plan survey to gather information from residents to help us understand what do residents value, what are they willing to invest, and we also got information from staff to understand their perspective on different levels of service. This was combined with the financial information as well, collected in stage 1. And based off this information, we worked with staff to select 3 proposed level of service options. The third step was what we call a scenario setup. Within the system that we use called Citywide, we were able to model those 3 scenarios, which we'll discuss shortly. This helped us understand how, for example, different levels of investment are projected to impact the condition of assets as well as the risks. After that was completed, we then re-engaged staff to hold what we call a scenario analysis review session. In this session, the intention was to go through each of the scenarios and to present the outcomes in terms of projected changes in asset condition, projected changes in asset risks, capital investments required to support that. That led to the 5th step, which was a staff recommendation of the proposed level of service option that they feel is best for the municipality. And then today, here we are at step 6, where we are engaging council to review those options. Ultimately, the objective for today is to select one of those options. That option will become the proposed level of service, which will be presented in the 2025 asset management plan. So now that I've gone through those 6 steps, I'm going to walk you through some of the key pieces of information that we found in each of those steps. So starting off with the data collection and analysis, as I said, we worked closely with your staff on collecting the asset records. So we loaded close to 7,000 assets. For every single asset, as I mentioned, we collected key information. So this screenshot is showing you some of those pieces of information. That includes things like the name of the asset, when the asset was constructed or acquired, the historical cost, what the estimated cost of replacing that asset is today, what the projected condition of it might be today based on assessed condition information, and then additional attributes. In this case, you're seeing the VIN number for fleet. In other cases, we might have things like the size of a main. So kudos first off to your staff for working on this with us. It's not a small undertaking, as you can imagine, but it's a crucially important step to ensuring that the analysis is predicated on good foundational information. So that might be leading to a question of, well, what do we know about our assets? What kind of baseline information does this tell us? So one thing that we look at is what is the replacement cost of your assets? What that means is what is the estimated cost to replace the asset with a comparable asset, in this case as of December 2024. What we found is that if we look at all of the assets within the municipality as of that date, there is over $329 million worth of infrastructure assets. Most of that is associated with water and wastewater networks, and a sizable portion is also associated with other categories like storm and buildings, with the balance associated to the other asset categories. So we know that there's a significant inventory of assets and that they have a high value. We also sought to understand what is the current condition of our assets. If you recall back to one of the earlier slides, we looked at current versus proposed. So this next slide, which looks at a condition breakdown, would reflect a current metric. Again, that is based on past measurement, based on actual data. So this graph here is showing you the portfolio condition. So what we did is for every asset, we were able to estimate its condition. This graph here is showing you the distribution of the condition of your assets based on the replacement cost value. If we look at it kind of broadly, we see that nearly 80% of assets are in fair or better condition as of December 2024. Now, something that's very important to consider when looking at condition is that condition is dynamic. So condition will change over time. The same thing will apply again to maybe your car or your house. The condition of your house, today versus 10 years ago is probably a little bit different. So when we talk a little bit later about some of the proposed level of service options, we will see that condition will change. And one of the primary reasons condition will change is the investment levels. Another important question that we explored through this project and that we'll be presenting on the next slide is seeking to understand what we call the average annual requirement. This can also be considered the optimal annual investment. What that represents is the cost to replace every single asset once it reaches the end of its useful life. That's how long we expect the asset to last, and to complete any recommended rehabilitations. So this graph here is showing you the capital projections. It is grouped in 5-year buckets, and the colors indicate the category to which the assets are associated with. The red dotted line is indicating the average annual requirement. So that's the amount of money you would need to save or spend each year, again, to ensure that when an asset needs to be replaced based on its estimated useful life, you have the funds to do so. Naturally, you'll see that there's going to be some periods of time when investment is higher than other periods of time. This would simply reflect generally just the period when the asset was kind of constructed. And so there might be some years where you had more development, more assets constructed at the same time, and therefore those assets are generally kind of all coming up for replacement around the same time. We know that the investment requirement, so again, that average annual requirement, that's your optimal investment, is significantly greater than the sustainable capital funding sources. That's a position that every municipality I've worked with is unfortunately in. And so a question that we ask is, what does that look like? So this next graph here is showing you in blue what the average annual requirement is by asset category. And then in pink, it's showing you what the reinvestment is. So from sustainable sources, how much are we generally investing in the asset category? So we can see that throughout, there is more investment requirement than there is funding. The level of difference is a little bit varied by category, but there is certainly consistency in that it's different. There is more investment needed than available. So that was the first stage. Again, data collection. Let's understand the current state. Let's understand where we're at. Let's understand questions to, or sorry, I should say answers to really important questions like what do we own? What condition is it in? What is it worth? What investment is needed? And when is that investment needed? The second stage was that discovery stage. And so in that stage, we sought to combine this information with other important inputs like what do our residents value? So this information was pulled from your strategic plan survey. We chose to use that survey as it was quite recent. It also had a very high response rate at about 10%. There's two graphs here. The graph on the left is showing you the resident satisfaction with municipal services. So what we can see is that 75% of residents who responded to the survey indicated that they're either somewhat satisfied or very satisfied, actually closer to 83%, with the services provided by the municipality. So that's a good news story. It means that generally, residents are happy with what they're getting. Another item that the survey sought to understand was what are residents' attitudes and opinions towards taxation changes. So that's the graph on your right. It's looking at taxation changes and whether or not residents would support them. What we see is that 36%, so just over a third, indicated that they would be willing to increase taxes gradually to maintain service. And then approximately another, looks like 37%, were willing to maintain current taxes, recognizing that will result in some service reductions. So we can see that, yes, residents are generally happy with what they're getting, and a portion of them are willing to increase service through increased expenditures to support that, or to maintain current investments, recognizing that there will be reductions in service levels. The survey also asked residents to identify opportunities to improve the municipality, and there were several options that they could select. This is a subset of those options. What we see is that consistently infrastructure-related options are indicated as a method of improving the municipality. What that means is that respondents generally view investment in infrastructure as a strategy to improve the municipality. We also considered other kind of important considerations. So we looked at the strategic plan. We noted that the strategic plan advances and supports asset management. It recognizes it as an important tool to achieve strategic objectives of the municipality. We also noted that core infrastructure, particularly water and wastewater, is identified as a priority. It's also generally identified as a lower level of satisfaction. And that respondents are generally willing to maintain or increase taxation to support investments in infrastructure. So all of that information, again, kind of looking back at what are our assets telling us, what are our residents telling us, what are some of the other kind of strategic considerations that we should hold when making this, when working through this question. We landed on 3 proposed level of service options. So those options was 1, let's look at maintaining current investment for all asset categories. The importance of this is to understand whether or not it's a viable option considering projected changes in condition and risk of the portfolio. Another option that we looked at was understanding what would be needed in terms of investment to maintain the condition of the portfolio. So through step 1, where we collected all of the information on your assets, we were able to determine the average condition by asset category. So for example, the average condition of the road network or the average condition of fleet, and that was the condition target that we set for scenario 2. The third scenario was to invest at what we call 70% of the average annual requirement. So if you recall back several slides, we showed what the investment would be needed each year to replace every asset when it reaches the end of its life. And so in this case, we're looking at investing 70% of it rather than 100% of it. Based on those options, like I said, the next step was to do some modeling to put into the system those conditions and to understand, based on those conditions, what are the changes that we are projecting to see in our assets over time. So again, the first scenario that we looked at is let's maintain our investment, meaning we're not going to increase it, we're just going to maintain it. Let's see kind of what happens to our assets over time. This will be presented in this next slide in a table format. You'll also see some graphs later on, so don't worry too much about trying to kind of memorize or jot down the figures. The intention here is to kind of show the general dynamics and the patterns that we're seeing between the scenarios. What we will see and are projected to see for scenario 1 is if we maintain investment, which as we recall is significantly less than that optimal investment level, we will see declines in condition over time. The rate of decline will vary slightly by asset category, simply based on kind of the need versus the current funding, but average condition is projected to reach very poor within, in some cases, a decade, in other cases, several decades. So we know that maintaining the investment, while it provides some affordability benefits, it comes with some risks. That's the second thing we look at as well, is risk. So when we look at risk, we're looking at two factors. The first is what is the probability or what is the likelihood that this asset will fail? The second factor is if it does fail, what are the consequences that we're dealing with? We are able to calculate this for every single asset using the information specific to each asset. So in the data stage, we are able to determine the replacement cost of an asset and the condition of an asset. Those are generally the two most common factors we look at when evaluating risk. And based on that information, we're able to determine the risk scores for your assets. What we'll see is that generally risk is going to change inverse to condition, meaning as the condition declines, the risk is going to increase. This table here is showing you by asset category when the average risk is projected to reach very high. For some categories, this never happens, although it is still at a high level. For other asset categories, this happens within a decade or two. The second scenario that we looked at is to maintain current condition. So again, how we did that was through stage 1, when we collected all of the information on your assets, we were able to establish what the average condition is for each asset category. We then told the system, this is our condition goal. What that means is the system works to understand what investment would be needed to support that goal. Investment is generally applied when the condition is below that goal. Generally, what we'll see is that the investment required to maintain your condition is close to that optimal funding level. It's a little bit less, but it's quite close. Given the existing funding levels, we know that that would equate to a pretty significant increase. So this next table here is showing you what is the average annual investment required under this scenario. That's the kind of the second column. And what is the current investment? So under this scenario, we would need less than your average annual requirement, but close to it. We would need about 7.2. We're currently investing about 1.7. That means we would need about 5.4 more each year. The third scenario that we looked at is to invest 70% of the average annual requirement. That's the optimal funding. What we'll see, and we'll see this clearly when we start to look at some of the graphs, is that the projected condition and risk outcomes are between scenario 1 and 2. So it's kind of a middle ground option. The investment levels will require increase from current. Currently, again, we're investing about 1.7. Under scenario 3, we would need about 5.6. Conditions will still decline over time. That is simply because while we are investing significantly more, we are still investing less than the optimal need. Therefore, we do have, in some cases, assets that are in use, what we would call beyond their useful life. Compared to scenario 2, we will see that the rate of decline of condition is slower. And risks will generally follow the same trends. So what we're going to show in the next couple of slides is condition comparison graphs. So for each asset category and each scenario, we're able to plot projected changes in condition and risk over time by scenario. What we'll see is pretty consistent patterns between the scenarios. So from a condition lens, we'll see that the best outcome is scenario 2, where we're maintaining the condition. The second best outcome is scenario 3, where we're investing 70% of the average annual requirement. And the worst outcome is scenario 1, where we're maintaining our current investment levels. Across all scenarios, you'll generally see some fluctuations in condition. That's going to reflect the natural degradation of assets, meaning you're not going to prematurely replace an asset just because it only has 20% of estimated useful life remaining. You'll wait until it's closer to the end of its lifespan. So based on that, you'll see some fluctuations. So before I say anything else, I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. Okay, so this graph here is showing projected changes in condition for the water network. The green line is scenario 1, so that's maintaining your investment. The blue line is scenario 2, where you're seeking to maintain the condition. And then the purple line is scenario 3, where you're investing 70% of the average annual requirement. So as you can see in this graph, and you'll see in the others, again, the worst outcomes that we're seeing is continuing with current investments. Those are the kind of green line at the bottom. The best outcomes that we're seeing is if we select scenario 2, where we're maintaining the condition, and the in-between scenario is scenario 3, where we're investing 70% of the need. This next graph here is showing you the wastewater network. So again, we are seeing the same overall patterns in terms of the projected changes and the trends in those changes by scenario. This graph here is showing you the road network. Again, if we maintain the current investments, we are projected to see some declines in condition. That's simply because we're investing significantly less than the need. Therefore, we have assets that are in use beyond their useful life. This contrasts with scenarios 2 and 3, where we have more assets getting more investment, and therefore condition is higher. As another example, this is showing land improvements. Again, we're seeing very consistent kind of outcomes in terms of the projected changes in condition, comparing one scenario to another. With, again, if we maintain investment, condition is projected to decline. If we increase investment through either scenario 2 or 3, condition is expected to be improved. The second factor, as I mentioned, that we look at is risk. So when we look at risk, we're asking two key questions. One is, what's the likelihood or the probability that an asset's going to fail? The second is, if it does fail, what are the consequences that I'm dealing with? Every single asset has a customized risk score based on its specific factors. So for each asset, we have a risk model. Generally, the risk model will look at the condition for the probability of failure and the replacement cost for the consequence of failure. It may also consider additional factors. For example, mains, we would look at the size of the pipe. For every single asset, that will generate a risk score somewhere between 1 and 25. 25 is going to represent your highest risk. What that means is that asset has a high probability of failure and a high consequence of failure. 1 would represent your lowest risk. That would mean the asset has a low probability of failure and a low consequence of failure. What we see again by scenario is quite consistent. So the risk outcomes are best, meaning they're the lowest under scenario 2. They're the second best for scenario 3, and they are the worst, meaning they're the highest for scenario 1. Similar to condition, we will see some natural fluctuations in risk. That's going to be a reflection of the fluctuations in asset condition that kind of naturally occur just due to the life cycle of assets. So like I did with condition, I will show you a few comparison graphs for risks by asset category. So this next slide is looking at the road network. Again, the higher the number for risk, the poorer the outcome. So we are seeing that scenario 1, where we're maintaining the investment, the risks are increasing. We are seeing that scenario 2, where we're maintaining the condition, the risks are the lowest. And scenario 3, where we're investing about 70% of the need, it's in between. Again, you're going to see that that dynamic is generally consistent across every asset category. So that was kind of the second stage. The third stage that we look at is the financial analysis. So here we're trying to understand under each scenario what investment is needed, what investment do we currently have available to us, what are the any growth impacts that we're expecting, and what are the differences between the funds needed and the funds available. Based on that, that helps us understand what changes in taxes or rates are required to bridge that gap. And we also look at different phase-in periods, considering the constraints of affordability. To do that financial analysis, there are some assumptions that are applied. One is that the increase in taxes or rates has to be applied entirely to capital investment. We are not factoring inflationary adjustments, so that would be generally kind of an additional amount that would be determined each year based on inflationary impacts, and we're not including operational increases. When we look at growth, we look specifically to your latest DC study, and specifically we are only looking at the benefits to existing development. So those are costs that cannot be recovered through development charges. Some common examples would be basically a benefit to the existing population, such as eliminating a problem that's not due to growth. So in this case, we look to that study to understand, what are those costs, and we incorporate that into our analysis. This meets the requirements of OREG, which show, what are the assumptions and how did we consider those assumptions in the financial strategy. So if we look at your most recent growth study, these costs are only associated with tax-funded assets. There was none identified for rate-funded assets. This table is showing the average annual investment over 5 years, 10 years, 15, and 20. When we look at the financial strategy, one of the factors that we look at is what we call the phase-in period. So for every scenario, we look at what is the total tax or rate change needed. Recognizing that there are affordability constraints, we look at, can we phase this in over a longer period of time to kind of create some more affordability? So in this case, we're looking at 4 time periods. We're looking at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and 20-year periods. When we model the scenarios, we are looking at just kind of an immediate increase. So there will be some reductions in performance outcomes based on, what time period you might select. Generally, the dynamic will be consistent. That dynamic is that if you increase the phase-in period, you will hold, more risks than if you shorten the phase-in period. Some of those risks include things like accelerated asset deterioration, meaning you're not maybe doing those rehabilitation investments, the assets kind of declining in condition. You have more and more assets that are falling into poor condition. There's generally some risks or potential for service disruptions or reliability issues. Simply put, you have aging assets. Aging assets are more likely to fail. That can result in, issues that might lead to service disruptions. Safety risks are a potential. Again, if you just have more assets in poor condition, there's more potential for things like accidents to occur. Another risk is what we call a rising infrastructure backlog. Simply put, this just means that you have more and more assets that need to be replaced. that can be a challenge to execute and expensive. So considering the assumptions noted earlier on, considering the growth projections as well, and the benefit to existing costs, we are then able to calculate the projected changes in taxes to support that. So this next table is showing you for each scenario what the total tax rate change would be and what the annual change would be based on a 5, 10, 15, or 20-year period. You will notice that scenario 1, which is to maintain current investment, does have a cost. That is because of the benefit to existing costs that were noted in an earlier slide. What we see is that scenario 2 has the highest increase to support it. As noted in earlier slides, it is the most costly. So this makes sense that it would carry the highest. Scenario 3 is less. If we look at a 5-year period, what this translates into is that for scenario 2, it would require a 12.2% tax increase each year for 5 years. Again, recognizing there are affordability constraints to doing that, we look at other time periods. So if we look at a 20-year period, this would translate to 2.7%. For scenario 3, the overall increase is less. So that's why we're seeing a lower number. And when we look at a 5-year period, this would translate to a 10.1% increase each year for 5 years. When we look at a 20-year period, this would translate to a 2.1% increase. We look at the same question or pieces of information for your rate-funded assets. Again, we're using rate-funded financial information to inform that. What we see is that for scenario 1, which again is to maintain the current investment, there is no increase. In this case, there is no benefit to existing, and that's why you're seeing no value there. For scenario 2, that's going to be the most costly scenario. As noted earlier, it does come with the best outcomes in condition, but it is the most costly. So here for a 5-year, that would be a 15.7%. For a 20-year, a 3.7%. And for scenario 3, we're looking at slightly lower values at 10.2 and 2.5% respectively. We also look at the wastewater network. Again, in this case, there is no benefit to existing. That's why you're seeing an NA under scenario 1. For scenario 2, that would translate to an 8.1% increase each year for 5 years, or a 2% increase each year for 20 years. For scenario 3, that would translate to a 4.8% under 5 and a 1.2% for 20. So considering all of the information presented today, staff identified a recommendation to Council on a proposed level of service to adopt. This considers, as noted, the factors of condition, projected changes, risk changes, and investment levels. The recommended scenario is scenario 2, that's to maintain current condition. Phased in over 20 years, this would translate into a 2.7% increase each year for tax-funded assets, a 3.7% increase for water, and a 2% increase for the wastewater network. As a next step, as noted earlier at the onset of the presentation, Council is to select a proposed level of service option. Ultimately, this option will then be reflected in the asset management plan as the selected option, and forthcoming decisions, particularly around budget, would be recommended to align with the option selected today. With that, that concludes my presentation for today. I thank you for your time, for your attention. And I also want to take a moment to thank your staff. As you can imagine, this is not a small undertaking to take on this project, and they've been quite helpful to work with. So thank you to them for that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation and very thorough information that you presented to us. Council, do you have any questions? Clear. No, okay, perfect. So thank you for your presentation. Now we will move on and move on to the vote.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Okay. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. All right, Council. So looking at our motion, it is to receive the report and to adopt scenario 2. Do we have any questions or discussion on this? All in favor? Yeah, a question?
Okay.
Okay, so we'll give one for a seconder. Madame Charon, Monsieur Cléroux, c'est une question.
Merci, Mme la mairesse. Donc, juste m'assurer que je comprends bien ce qui est proposé et l'incidence aussi qu'il peut y avoir sur des entrées d'argent qui ne sont pas récurrents, qui ne sont pas garantis. Si le Conseil va de l'avant avec la recommandation de cibler 2,7 ce que je comprends, c'est que ce 2,7-là a été identifié sur une période de 20 ans, évidemment, mais basé seulement sur des argents qui sont plus ou moins garantis à la municipalité. Donc, est-ce que ça voudrait dire, par exemple, sur ces 20 ans-là, advenant que les conseils suivants décident de maintenir cette ligne-là et qu'il y a soit des subventions ponctuelles qui nous sont disponibles et qui nous sont octroyées, est-ce que au fil de chaque budget, il serait possible que le Conseil, suite à une recommandation d'administration, par exemple, puisse ajuster le 2,7 en conséquence des subventions reçues, soit l'année précédente ou en prévision de l'année qui va venir?
Merci, M. Cléroux.
Merci pour la question. Pour répondre à la question, en fait, à chaque budget, vous allez devoir décider, va voter sur 2,7 %. Donc, si le Conseil décide que cette année-là, ils ne veulent pas, ben, ça va être à leur choix.
Merci, M. Thibault. Follow-up, M. Cléroux. M. Monfort.
Juste pour clarifier ou ajouter sur ce que mon collègue a dit, là, c'est sûr que si on a une subvention ponctuelle, oui, ça va réduire la partie du 2,7 % également.
Merci. Any other questions or comments? All in favor? Carried. Now we're going to move on to item 4, scheduling of meetings.
La prochaine réunion, c'est une réunion ordinaire le mardi 24 février.
Merci, M. Dion. Item 6, confirmation bylaw 6.1 2026-9 to confirm council procedures at special meeting held February 10th, 2026.
Soit résolu que le règlement numéro 2026-9 pour confirmer les procédures du Conseil à sa réunion du 10 février 2026 soit adopté en première, deuxième et troisième lecture.
Merci. Proposal appuyé. Madame Leblanc, M. Cléroux. Accepted in first reading, accepted in second reading, accepted in third reading, carried. Item 7, adjournment.
Ajournement à 16h42.
Madame Secretary. Madame Charon, M. Cou, all in favor?